Welcome! In this video, we are going to begin our exploration of looking at how to extend blocks with hooks in WordPress. To do this, we will be using block filters. These are a set of JavaScript and PHP hooks in WordPress we could use to modify existing block properties. Now, I want to point out at the beginning that sometimes extending existing blocks makes sense. However, there are times when rebuilding the block and creating your own custom block based on an existing one actually makes a lot more sense. When it comes to extending blocks with JavaScript in WordPress, we have a few helpful filters that we can hook into. We have register block type, which will let us override or modify any of the settings that are passed when register block type is called. We then have blocks.getSaveElement, which will allow us to modify just the save element part if we want to make modifications there. We could also call getSaveContext.extraProps if we wanted to just pass extra properties into the save element. GetBlockDefaultClassName will let us modify the existing or the default class name for a block. GetBlockAttributes will let us modify or get access to the attributes for a block. And finally, unregister block type will do exactly what it says and unregister an existing block type for a user. Now, it's really important to mention here that filtering saved block content may or possibly will break existing blocks. And we'll look at this in depth over the next couple videos because it's important to understand when applying a filter may break existing things or what might happen if that filter is removed, and if doing this on the JavaScript side is the best approach. We won't look at it in this video, but there are several PHP hooks that will allow us to do things that give us the same final result, but without breaking our code. So this is an important note at the beginning here. Now, in addition to block hooks, we also have editor hooks. Things like editor.blockEdit will let us modify the actual edit call for a specific block, and block_list_block will let us modify the wrapper that blocks appear inside the editor. Down the road, we'll see more and more hooks come into WordPress. Some of them may be block hooks, some of them may be editor hooks, and we'll probably begin to see others over time continues. So let's turn our attention now to looking at how to set up our filters. First, we have to enqueue our JavaScript. Now, technically, we could put block filter code inside of the code that we're using to build normal blocks, and I'll trust definitely at this point in the course that you know how to enqueue that stuff. However, what I like to do is set up a separate JavaScript file that is just going to be my filters. This will ensure that it runs after my blocks are enqueued, and in general, I just think is a nice organizational approach. However, you can put this in different places as long as it is actually enqueued in the editor specifically. It will need to be running in that context for most of these to work. Then we need to call wp.hooks_add_filter. WP hooks is a set of filter and action type hooks inside of JavaScript that we have the ability to work with now. And in order to hook into any of these block filters, we'll need to use add filter from that library. We'll look at how to pull that out in a moment. Now, add filter is going to take 3 parameters. We give it the filter we want to hook into, we give it a unique name for our filter operation, and then we give it a callback function, which will actually be where we execute our filter code. So then our final step of this process is to create our own function with our custom filter code, and that is what is going to be our callback function that we set up as our third parameter in step number 2, working with add filter. So this is at a high level how it works. Let's look now at what this will look like in our code. Okay, so to start off, imagine that you have a JavaScript file enqueued. So whichever approach you're going to end up taking, we have this empty file here. The first thing we would do is grab add filter from inside of WP hooks. So this will be the function that we use, and of course we'll destructure it in this way just to make it easier to reference. Then we go ahead and call add filter, which takes 3 parameters. The first one is going to be the filter and the hook that we want to hook into. This might be a block filter, it might be an editor filter, there are more filters, etc. So this is the format of what that will look like. It's usually the modular namespace and then the specific hook itself. Then we need to give it a unique name. So this is going to be something that is unique across all of the filters that are possibly called. So we give it a namespace where we see custom, and then we give it a descriptive name in this format. Now this is a little bit confusing at first because this process is not necessary on the PHP side of hooks. Usually we're just used to seeing the filter to hook into, and then this last part which is our callback function. So here we have the callback function that will actually execute, but we do need the second parameter here as well, kind of our namespace descriptive of name of what this filter is specifically going to be referred to as. So this is our first part, and this will need to be set up like this in queued and then call add filter for any of the filters that you want to look at. So let's take the next step now and look at what this might look like in action. Okay, so here we have an example fully coded out that would actually work. Now we're going to still assume that you are getting the add filter from WP data, just like we showed before. However, now we're going to call register block type, which is one of the filters, blocks.register block type. We will give it a namespace name for this filter that is happening, and then we give it a actual function that we will have to write to serve as the callback function. So here we can see we set up our add filter. Then down in our own code, we would call extend paragraph block. We would make our own function up. Now this takes the parameters of settings and name, which will look at the documentation of how to figure out what we're going to get access to with each filter. And then we would write a conditional check. Since this filter is going to run on every single block, we want to make sure that we're only going to modify the block or blocks that we want. There are several ways to do this, but if we're modifying a single block, this is the simplest. You'll see the triple equal sign looks a little bit different here in the presentation, but that is a triple equal sign, checking that the core paragraph is the same as the name of the block. So then inside of here, we could do something like get our settings and change the title to be new paragraph or whatever it is that you want to modify. And we'll look at an example soon of how to modify everything inside of this filter. So this is just an example. The most important part to point out though, is that at the very end, we need to return settings back. So the way filters work both with PHP and JavaScript in WordPress is you get something, you modify it or don't modify it, and then you send it back. If you do not return settings back, this will break all your blocks. So you need to make sure you return settings. However, you can see we only modified the settings for one of the blocks. So as long as this JavaScript is in queued and it's running after your blocks, or in this case, it's a core block, so it wouldn't matter where this is running, then this is the basic setup of how you would work with the block filters in WordPress. Now, I'll point out again that each filter has its own different parameters. However, all filters must return something. So before we wrap up here and move into actually setting all this up and practice working with each one of these filters, let's take a look at the documentation real quick, because that'll get you an idea of what parameters you need and get access to and what things you have to return. So if we come over to the Gutenberg documentation, the Gutenberg handbook, there's a section filter reference. And the first section of that are block filters. We see the first one here is block style variations, and we're going to actually look at that in a whole separate section of this course because there's more to that. So we're going to skip over that one for now. Then we come down into our actual filters. We see register block type, which allows us to get all of the block settings and override it. Here we can see an example where they're making sure that it's not, they're just going to modify core list and return that if it isn't. And then they're going to change the setting supports to support a custom class name. Remember, you could change any of the values, including supports. So this is similar to the basic setup we saw before. Then we have get saved element, which will modify this save function. And some note here that we'll get into, there might be some complexity. This is where sometimes I wonder if it's a good idea to extend a block or build a core one, is that you basically need to clone the existing element or bust down into all of the children of it to modify a block's edit or save function in depth. So we'll circle back to that just to show you at a high level what they are. Extra props allows you to add extra props into a save function. And there's a little example of how we could add background color red into, let's see, what is this applying it to? Is this going to apply to every single block maybe? I don't know if we want to do that. Yeah, background color to all blocks. And it points out that validation errors may happen if we don't have this running. Get block default class name. So we could say, hey, if it's a core code block, then change it to be something else. Switch block type when it's transforming. We won't actually look at this. This is a bit more complex, but want to point out that it's there. Getting a block attributes to manipulate them. That could be helpful. And then notice we switch from block filters to editor filters. And now in the editor, we can modify an entire edit component. But note that this does often involve creating a higher order component where we basically get our initial settings and then we modify what we are sending back. So this is where it's going to get a little bit more complicated, and wrapping stuff, modifying minor things like adding in extra inspector controls can be pretty easy. But if you want to get into editing the core block edit function, it might get a little bit complex, and definitely some experience with React and working with children and destructuring or deconstructing components and building them back up is going to be something you need in your tool set there. Editor block list is, as I mentioned, the wrapper component. So if you ever looked in the editor, you know that you have some code running there. And again, we're going to be creating a higher order component and basically just modifying and passing new things down into it. We also have unregistered block type, which could be helpful for unregistering certain types of blocks. And there is a whitelist pattern if you only want to allow certain blocks. Notice that we have this allowed block list, and it's basically going to unregister any block that is not inside of this array right here. You can do the same thing hiding blocks from the inserter, but I believe, yep, notice now we're down into PHP hooks. So as mentioned, there are a couple of PHP hooks, and we'll look at some of them specifically a little bit later on. And then managing block categories is another one. Again, this is on the PHP side of things, and we've already looked at in this course earlier, pointed out how to work with block categories. Pretty simple to do. Now, I'll point out real quickly that there are more hooks coming that are experimental at this point, but will be filled out, parser hooks, as well as I believe there's one more autocomplete hooks, and we're going to kind of glaze over them at this point. However, keep your eyes on the filter reference here. This will probably continue to grow and has at least, it tells you, let me just come back to one. You should be able to find what properties you get, and then usually the first property or parameter that you get, you got to make sure that you return that as well. So not all of these are super documented, but that should hopefully help a little bit. So in this one, we're getting props. We got to make sure that we return props. We're getting class name and a block name. We got to make sure we return a class name, right? So that's the basic syntax and format. Hopefully this will help you just get started here. And of course, we will be diving into all of this in coming videos with more examples. So the thing I want to end on here is that sometimes it makes sense to extend core blocks, but sometimes you may actually be wanting to build your own custom block if the process of extending it gets too complicated. So from here, let's turn our attention to how to enqueue and set up filters on their own, and then getting into playing around with each of these in a little bit more depth.